Welcome so far to how to build a successful major donor program for your nonprofit. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes here, but I would love to hear from you. What do you hope to learn from today's class? And so we'll open up the chat and would love to see your questions and anything that you are hoping to learn in the chat pane. Hi, Debbie. Thanks for joining. Linda signing on. Awesome. All right. Well, it is 2 o'clock. I know there's still a few more people still signing on today, but I want to really get started with our class. So this is class 1 of how to build a successful major donor program for your nonprofit. Today's talk is going to be all about how to find new major donors and build relationships with them. And before turning this over to our lovely panelists and presenter Joe, we're gonna just go through a couple of housekeeping items. So for those of you who aren't familiar, CauseVox is a digital fundraising platform that helps you raise more with less effort. You can get rid of that clunky, complex software and replace it with CauseVox so you can run your donation pages, crowdfunding, peer-to-peer fundraising, and sell tickets for your fundraising events in less time with less hassle. So if you are interested in fundraising with CauseVox, just let me know, and I would love to hear from you. So I just want to go over our schedule for the Major Donor Program course. Today's class is happening now, and it's all about how to find new major donors. And then class number 2 is going to be on Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern, same time. You will get the Zoom link to join at that time as well. So you'll see that in your inbox following today's class. And class 2 is going to be all about how to ask for major gifts and keep your donors giving for a lifetime. So that's going to be really exciting. So hope to see you all at class 2. As far as what you're actually going to take away from the Major Donor Program course, there's some takeaways that we have, which includes the slides of class 1 and class 2, also the recordings. So you're going to get both of those in your inbox tomorrow for our class today. You are also going to get Joe's Asking Scripts guide, which are downloadable templates that you can use to actually implement everything that we're going to talk about in these classes. So that's going to be really valuable resource for you. So keep an eye out for that in the chat pane and in the emails for class number 2. If you are interested in using CauseVox, you can use our basic plan to run your fundraising for free. And then I will also be giving you a one-on-one consultation offer to really just see if you want to go over any plans that you have to implement your major donor program, or if you want to just chat about running your donation page with CauseVox or any other more CauseVox related questions. You and I can always sit down and have a discussion. So I'll give you my booking link for that. So as we get started with our course today, I do want to let you know that, of course, like I just said, everything's being recorded. You're going to get all the slides in your inbox tomorrow. We are going to have a Q&A, so feel free to put all of your questions in the chat pane and the Q&A pane as well, and we'll be going over all those at the end. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome Joe. So Joe Gerecht has been a professional fundraiser for over 20 years. He's served in many positions like development director, executive director, board members, consultants to hundreds of organizations. So we are really learning from the best today when it comes to our developing a major donor program. So thank you, Joe, for joining us, and I'd love to just turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Candace, and thanks everybody for being here. For those of you here live, and then I know we also have lots of folks who are going to be watching the recording. Welcome to them as well when you get to it. I'm going to switch over to some slides. so that we can walk through today's presentation. All right, there we go. Can we see those okay, Candace?
Yep, looks
All right,
good.
fantastic. Okay, so as Candace said, my name's Joe Gorecht, and today is the first module in our class, How to Build a Successful Major Donor Program for Your Nonprofit. This is module number 1, How to Find New Major Donors and Build Relationships with Them. I want to thank you again for being here and thank Candace and CauseVox for hosting this class. Our goal for this program is to help your nonprofit build a well-rounded major donor program, one that will help you find new major donors, get them passionate about your work, solicit them for gifts, and keep them giving for a lifetime, no matter the size of your organization and no matter the size of your fundraising team. As I said, this class consists of 2 modules. Today's module will focus on how to find and cultivate major donors. And our second module, offered later this week, which is also going to be recorded, will focus on how to find or how to make major donor asks and how to properly steward your major donors so they keep giving for a lifetime. So between the 2 class modules, we'll be covering all 4 components of the major donor fundraising funnel. Now, Candace already told you a little bit about me, so I won't go into that. But as she mentioned, this is the important part. I've been where you are today. I've served as a development director, an executive director, a board member, and a fundraising consultant to hundreds of nonprofit organizations. And I'm really excited to be joining you live from Philadelphia for this journey. So here's what we're going to be covering in today's class module. First, we're going to take a look at the major donor fundraising funnel to make sure you understand what the full process of major donor fundraising looks like. Then, we're going to take a look at the best ways to tell the story of your nonprofit so that it can appeal to as many major donors as possible. What's the best way to tell the story of your organization with a major donor focus? After that, you'll learn a step-by-step system for finding a steady stream of new major donors for your nonprofit. And finally, we'll take a look at how to cultivate new major donors and build stronger relationships with them. And then, of course, for those of you who are on live, we'll have time for questions and answers. Does that sound good? Well, let's get started. And as we get started, one question that's really important for us to answer as we begin is just what do we mean when we say major donor? Am I talking about a donor who can give $1,000 to your nonprofit, 5,000, 100,000, $1,000,000? The answer as to what qualifies someone to be considered a major donor will differ for every organization. For some small nonprofits, a major donor might be anyone who can afford to give $1,000 or more per year. For a large national or international nonprofit, it might be someone who can afford to give $100,000 or more per year. Only you can say who qualifies as a major donor for your organization. Remember that because major donors provide such significant gifts to your nonprofit, you'll be spending more time and energy on personally cultivating and steward them. Thus, the question is, at what giving level is it worth your time and energy to be calling and meeting with a donor? Remember, too, that what qualifies as a major donor for your organization will likely change over time. When you're just starting out, a donor who gives you $500 or $1,000 to your nonprofit might be a major donor. But as your nonprofit becomes larger and grows its donor base, it may take 5,000 or 10,000 for someone to be considered a major donor. That type of growth is natural and to be expected. As you think through what qualifies someone to be considered a major donor at your nonprofit, I want you to keep 2 things in mind. First, remember that for this class, we are primarily looking at individual donors. Many of the strategies we discuss in this program will work for corporate and foundation donors, but you need to remember that the biggest source of available funds for nonprofit organizations like yours is from individual givers. Foundation grants, corporate sponsorships, and government funding programs are all important, but In an average year, between 65 and 80% of the money given to nonprofits comes from individual donors. The most recent data for the most recent year, 2019, that we have data on, 69% of all donations came from individual donors, and that didn't include bequests. So, and obviously those are mostly individual giving as well. So most of the money available to your nonprofit comes from individual donors, and that also includes family foundations that are really just giving vehicles for individuals and families. Second thing to keep in mind when considering whether or not someone is a major donor prospect for your organization, you want to look at capacity, at least until the donor has proved you otherwise. For example, let's say that a new donor gives your nonprofit $100, but you know that the donor could give $25,000 per year to your organization, which meets your criteria for major donor status. In that case, you should treat the person like a major donor and put them through your major donor cultivation system, even though they only gave you $100. If you do that and make one or two more asks, major asks, and the person continues to give at low levels, well, then you can move the donor to low dollar donor status and stop spending so much time cultivating them. But if a donor has major gift capacity, you should treat them like a major donor until they show you that they do not plan to give at a major giving level. And by showing you, I mean through several gifts over several asks. All right, now that we've discussed what makes someone a major donor, let's take a look at the other foundational issue that we need to talk about before we dive in, and that is the major donor fundraising funnel. The major donor fundraising funnel is the path that you will want to walk major donors down in order to get them to make a gift to your organization. There are four steps in the major donor funnel, and each is important if you want to build a successful, and this is important, a sustainable relationship with a major donor prospect. The four steps in order are as follows. First, prospecting. This step involves identifying new potential major donors to the organization, learning about them, and figuring out a path to reach them, and then making that first contact. The second step is cultivation. Once you have an initial meeting or conversation with a new prospective major donor, it's time to move to the cultivation phase. This step involves building a deeper and more meaningful relationship with your prospect. Ideally, over the course of the cultivation phase, your donor prospect will begin to feel more and more like part of your team. This phase could last 1 month or 2 years, depending on the organization and the donor. But generally, you should be able to move someone from first contact to first gift in 2 to 4 months. The third step in the major donor fundraising funnel is asking. This is where the rubber meets the road. This phase is when the organization makes the actual ask of the donor prospect. If the donor says yes, you move on to the next phase. If the donor says no, you move back into the cultivation phase, or in some cases, take the donor out of the fundraising funnel altogether. And the fourth and final step in the fundraising funnel for your major donors is stewardship. If the donor says yes to your ask, your work is not over. During the fourth phase, you will continue to steward the donor to grow and expand your relationship with her or him. Your goal during this phase is twofold. First, you'll want to strengthen the relationship to turn the donor into a lifelong giver to your nonprofit. And second, you'll want to capitalize on this deepening relationship to get the donor to open up their network to your organization to help introduce you to new major donor prospects. While the amount of time that donors will remain in each phase of the fundraising funnel will vary based on the donor and on the organization, it's imperative that each major donor prospect you are pursuing goes through each phase in the fundraising funnel. Far too many nonprofits jump immediately from prospecting to asking, meaning they skip cultivation, or they stay forever in cultivation and never make an ask. Similarly, once they get a yes, many organizations cut off contact with the donor, never entering the stewardship phase, and simply progressing through a series of yearly asks, which of course leads to donor fatigue. Skipping any phase in the major donor fundraising funnel is a mistake that will cost your organization money in the long run. For example, if you move directly from prospecting to asking, you may get a yes. It's unlikely, but possible. But it will almost certainly be for less than the gift you could have received had you properly cultivated the donor. It is also unlikely that a donor in such a scenario will be comfortable opening up their own friend network to your organization because you haven't built up a good, solid relationship with them through the cultivation process. So, my best advice is to not skip steps. Okay, now that you understand the major donor fundraising funnel, let's take a look at your donor messaging. Specifically, I want to start by talking about how you're currently telling the story of your nonprofit and how you can tweak the story you're telling to make sure it appeals to major donors. And this is important before we even talk about how to find, like where to find new major donors, because we want to look at what we're saying to them. If there's one simple maxim that sums up major donor messaging, it's this: big donors fund big visions. Remember that major donors don't want to give major gifts to fund small visions. Big donors fund big visions. So, how well are you telling the story of your nonprofit? And no, I'm not talking about that boilerplate history of our organization or mission statement that you have on your website. Certainly not anything that was put together by a committee of your board members hammered out 15 years ago. I'm talking about story in its truest sense. I'm talking about good and evil, heroes and villains, adventures, conquests, battles lost, and battles won. Now, you may think your organization doesn't have a story like that, but let me assure you that it could and then it should if you would let it. You see, we human beings, we like to think in terms of stories. There's something about them that speaks to the innermost part of our being. We like to get caught up in stories, and not just any stories, big stories. We like to get caught up in stories and adventures that are bigger than ourselves, to join together for a common goal and a common good. These stories have heroes who fight clearly on the side of the good and the right and the just, and they have villains who may be people, but they could be organizations or diseases or bad situations that people find themselves in that are squarely on the side of wrong. Everyone wants to be part of a story like that. And guess what? Your nonprofit has a story like that, or it could. So I'll ask you again, how well are you telling your nonprofit's story? Who's the villain of your story? Is it a disease that you're fighting to eradicate? Bad schools for our children? Hunger? Hopelessness? As for the hero of your story, well, there are several. First of all, there's you and your nonprofit and the people who are working with your nonprofit, your team, your staff, your volunteers, and especially the donors who fund your work. You need to understand what makes your organization uniquely qualified to fight this fight and win. You need to be able to articulate why your donors should care. You need to know why they should get caught up in your story and your mission and your vision. And you need to know what battles there have been. Where did your organization and your donors and your team win? Where did you face setbacks? How is your nonprofit saving the world or your small corner of it? If you can't talk like that, if you can't make the hairs on the back of your donor's neck stand up, then it's going to be hard to make your donors want to make major investments in your work. And here's the good news: I have never, ever seen a nonprofit that couldn't tell a story like that. You may think your nonprofit can't talk like that because you're an elite private school that fundraises to fill in the gaps around what your students pay in tuition. What if I told you that you're a force for good, educating the next generation of leaders, and that the future of your city, state, or country depended on what's going on in your classrooms today? You may think that your nonprofit can't tell its story in an emotional way because you're fighting a disease that only afflicts a minuscule portion of the population. But what if you remember that for those that you're helping, your organization is the difference between life and death? What if I told you that among those you're saving, there was a CEO who would launch the next Apple or General Motors, or a saint who would save millions of starving children, or a poet who would be remembered for hundreds of years? If you want to raise major gifts, you need to start telling the story of your nonprofit like that. You need to be more emotional. You need to think bigger about your nonprofit and about your mission. So often, nonprofits get caught in the rut of celebrating minor successes. We talk about helping 5% more people this year, or increasing academic outcomes, or feeding 800 more families this winter. All of those things are well and good and can be used to support the bigger story of your nonprofit, but they won't inspire donors as much as if you talk to them about how you're educating the future leaders of our country, ending hunger in Cincinnati, or providing free medical care to every single family in Carson City that needs it. Every nonprofit has a bigger story to tell if you'll only allow yourself to tell it. I once had an organization tell me that they can't cast a grand vision because they're only trying to maintain parks in our town. Well, sure, that's the work they're doing, but what's the vision behind that work? They're trying to provide safe outdoor recreation for kids in a city where there are scant opportunities and few parks. They're keeping children happy, healthy, and active while making their community a better place to live. They're providing space for families, friends, and events. They're making their city stronger and healthier. That's a big vision, one that donors will want to invest in. Your nonprofit has a big vision for the future. You have an important story to tell. Major donors want to get caught up in that story. So cast a big vision for your donors and prospects, then invite them to get involved and help make that vision a reality. Okay, now that we've talked about how to tell the story of your nonprofit, let's turn our attention to major donor prospecting. I want to start by talking about the three best ways to find new major donors for your organization. These three strategies are mining your own database, using non-ask events, and seeking major donor referrals. And they work separately or together to help you find hundreds of new major donors for your nonprofit. Let's start by talking about mining your own donor database. One of the most important things for any nonprofit to understand is that your fundraising program is like a sales funnel. There's a concept in business called a value ladder. Many types of businesses have products of varying price points. They bring in customers on lower ticket items, and they're able to move some of those customers up to higher ticket items. Take, for example, a landscaping company. They may have 1,000 customers who pay them to cut their lawns every week, which costs $25 every week. They may be able to upgrade a certain percentage of those lawn care customers to landscaping work, meaning the company comes out every year and plants flowers, mulches, and clears leaves. This service might cost $1,000 per year. The company may be able to convince a certain portion of these higher ticket customers to also pay to completely redesign their yards, taking out trees, building flower beds, and putting in shrubbery and sod and placing landscape lighting. The average cost for this might be $10,000. That's their value ladder. They have 1,000 customers who pay $25 per week, and thanks to mining that database of customers, they have 100 customers who pay an additional $500 per year for moderate landscaping work. And 10 of those customers also pay another $10,000 per year for a full yard redesign. Your nonprofit's database is the same. If you're like most nonprofits, you probably have a large number of small dollar donors, a mid-sized group of mid-level donors, and a smaller group of major donors. If that's true, I guarantee you that right now there are a number of small dollar and mid-level donors who have the capacity to give to your nonprofit at the major donor level. They haven't done so yet, Because you haven't identified them as having higher giving capacity and then cultivated them like major donors and asked for major gifts after building better and deeper relationships with them. The same is true for your mid level giving programs. You have right now small dollar donors in your database who can't give at the major donor level, but who could afford to give at the mid dollar level, but haven't done so yet. Your job as a fundraiser is to use the wealth screening tools and ideas at your disposal to screen your donor database and to figure out who is lurking in there that has major gift capacity but is not yet giving at that level. Then you need to start treating those donors like major donors by personally cultivating them and ultimately by asking them to give at ever increasing levels. Generally, this means that you'll want to move low dollar donors into mid level giving territory, and then after they give at the mid level, move them into major giving territory. That being said, sometimes you will be able to move lower dollar donors with major giving capacity directly into major gift territory. Either way, there's gold in your database. People who give to you at a lower level, but have the ability to give at a major donor level, are the single best prospects you have for major gifts, so long as you cultivate them the right way. Major donor cultivation, we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. Okay, so we've talked about how to mine the gold in your own database. So let's move on to another of the three best ways to find new major donors for your organization, and that is through non-ask events. One of the best ways to find new prospects for your nonprofit and to support your other prospecting efforts is to create a non-ask event strategy at your organization. If you already have a donor base, non-ask events can be used in conjunction with referrals, which we're going to talk about in a minute, to help you find new donors. But you can also use non-ask events even if you don't currently have many donors for your nonprofit. So, what is a non-ask event? A non-ask event is an event that you hold to introduce new prospects to your nonprofit. Some consultants call these introductory events or point of entry events. I call them non-ask events. As the name implies, while these events are ultimately geared at finding new donors, you won't be asking anyone for money at the event. Instead, you'll be talking to the attendees about your work and casting a vision for them about the future of your nonprofit. These events can be held at your office or at one of your facilities, or at the home or office of one of your board members or supporters. Good non-ask events last for 60 to 90 minutes and could include a tour of your facility if appropriate, lots of social time, a short presentation by your executive director, development director, or member of your board, and some light refreshments or cocktails or coffee. That's it. Nothing fancy and nothing too long or onerous. Just a quick and emotionally compelling introduction to the work of your nonprofit. The key to success with non-ask events is having a system for following up with the attendees to cultivate them and ultimately ask them for a gift. This means that your team will need to make sure to get contact information for every single person who attends the event. During the event, you should mention, as part of the presentation, that someone from the staff will be following up with everyone who is there to get their thoughts about your organization. Then, within 7 to 10 days after the event, someone from your development team who was at the event should pick up the phone to call every person who attended. During the call, you should thank them for coming and ask them if they have any questions about your work or your mission. Then ask them, would you ever see yourself getting more involved with our organization? Their answer to this question can guide you in your next steps. Ideally, they will express an interest in getting involved, either as a volunteer or as part of a committee, or simply as part of your email newsletter list. You can then place them into your prospect cultivation system with an eye to asking them for a first gift in 2 to 4 months. So, why are non ask events so effective? Because they are. Non ask events are effective because they're non threatening. You're not asking people to make a donation right away, and you're not charging a ticket price for people to come. There's no real commitment other than time. Instead, you're giving them the opportunity to come hear about your mission and meet your team. Non-ask events are also effective because they are non-threatening ways for your board, your donors, and your other supporters to make referrals. One of the best ways to get prospects to attend your non-ask events is to get your board members and other friends of your organization to attend the event and bring along a couple of people from their network. This is an easy way for people, including board members, to make introductions on your behalf. Many nonprofits that I know hold 3 or 4 non-ask events each year, and they ask certain board members, donors, and volunteers to captain these events by agreeing to attend and bring along 2 or 3 friends. If 4 of your supporters co-captain an event and each brings along 3 friends, that's 12 new prospects for your nonprofit, all together in one room. Some of your donors and supporters may also be willing to hold their own non-ask events on your behalf at their home or office or somewhere else, and to take responsibility for inviting their entire network to attend. If you develop a non-ask event schedule early in the year, your staff can also use non-ask events as a primary step in the cultivation process by inviting new prospects to come to the next regularly scheduled non-ask event at your facility. Your team can then use those non-ask events as easy reasons for a second donor touch after an initial prospect meeting or phone call. The key to success with non-ask events lies in setting up a system for using them at your organization. This means laying out a schedule of non-ask events well in advance and asking board members and other supporters to help you by getting their contacts to attend. You should explain to your supporters that their friends will not be asked for money at that first event, but will be contacted at a later date to ascertain their interest in your organization. Then be sure to follow up with each attendee after the event. Those attendees who express an interest in getting more involved should be placed into your cultivation system so that you can continue to build a relationship with them. With a little planning, every nonprofit, no matter how small or large, can use non-ask events successfully as an essential part of their donor funnel. All right, so we've talked about the first 2 out of the 3 big ways to find new major donor prospects. Now remember, these aren't the ways to find minor donors, low dollar donors, right? This is a class about major donors. We're not talking about direct mail prospecting. We're not talking about direct response online. All right, those are ways to spend money to acquire low dollar donors. We're talking about how to dig deep into your network and into your donor universe to find major donor prospects or people who have the capacity to be major donors. We've talked about mining your donor database and we've talked about non-ask events. The third great way to dig deep and find major donor prospects is by seeking out donor referrals. So, what is a donor referral? Simply put, a donor referral is when one of your current donors, board members, or volunteers introduces you to one of their friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, business partners, clients, or vendors. The introduction can be done in person, on the phone, or through email. No matter how the person makes the introduction, it's an opportunity for your donor to tell their contact why they support your organization and to put them in touch with a member of your team. Ideally, your fundraising team can take it from there. Once the warm introduction is made, your job as a fundraiser is to determine the person's interest, to build a relationship with them, and to walk them down the fundraising funnel. Now, donor referrals matter for 2 main reasons. First, people with the capacity to give major gifts tend to know other people with the same capacity. Your major donors likely work with, live near, and socialize with others who have the financial ability to make major gifts. The second reason why major donors or why donor referrals are so important is because cold prospecting is hard, especially when it comes to major donors. People with the capacity to give large gifts are often approached by dozens of nonprofits each year, if not more. Even if you do succeed in piquing the interest of a major donor prospect, it will take a long period of cultivation before you're able to ask for a major gift. On the other hand, if you're introduced to a new major donor prospect by someone the prospect trusts, such as a business partner or friend, you jump to the head of the line. The person automatically trusts your organization since their friend or colleague has vouched for you. This gives you a huge head start in the cultivation process. It gives you easy access to new prospects and will enable you to move to an ask much earlier than if you had not received an introduction. Let me also tell you that there are two very important rules that you'll need to keep in mind if you want to successfully solicit referrals from your current donors and prospects. The first rule is you have to build trust with your current donors. If you want your current donors to make referrals to new donors, you need to make sure that they trust you and your organization. They know how you treat your donors because they're a donor, and they're going to assume that you're going to treat their friends and colleagues the same way you've treated them. Are you regularly thanking and recognizing them? Are you being open and transparent with them? Are you meeting with them and calling them to cultivate them without always asking for a gift? If you're not stewarding your current donors the right way, they're not going to be willing to introduce you to their own friends, neighbors, and colleagues. And the second rule is you have to ask. Remember that if you want your donors to make referrals, you need to ask them to do so. Very few donors will offer to introduce you to their contacts without being asked to do so. And remember that when you ask, not every donor is going to say yes to making referrals, and that's okay. Many donors don't feel comfortable making these sorts of introductions. In my experience, even if you're doing a great job stewarding your major donors, only about 10 to 15% of them will feel comfortable actively making real introductions for you. Don't get discouraged. Those 10 to 15% who say yes will make a huge difference for your organization. Now, the best way to ask for referrals is to be direct. Sit down with your current donors, call them on the phone, meet with them over Zoom, and ask them, who else do you know that might be interested in our work? My recommendation is to make this type of ask one-on-one. Asking in a group setting, such as at a board meeting, is not nearly as effective as asking for referrals one-on-one. Similarly, sending an email or letter to one of your donors asking for referrals is unlikely to produce results. In my experience, a referral ask is best made as a standalone ask. I have seen some fundraisers ask for a gift and then in the same meeting ask for a referral. Um, in many cases, the donor will feel that you're downplaying the impact of their gift if they say yes to a donation and then you follow up with a referral ask. So I suggest ask your donors for money first, then thank them, recognize them, steward them, and continue to build the relationship. And then after that is done, come back for a different meeting and ask for a referral. And as you can probably see, referrals can also be used with non-ask events for a powerful 1-2 combination. By setting up non-ask events and then asking your current donors to attend and to bring a friend or two or three along with them, you are making it easier than ever for your current donors to refer new donors to your nonprofit in a non-threatening, non-stressful way. All right, so we've talked about three great ways to find new major donors. But how do you actually approach those new major donors for the first time? As a growing nonprofit, it's not enough to simply identify a great group of major donor prospects. You need to begin to engage with them. The way to engage with a new prospect is sometimes referred to as an entry point. This is the activity whereby the prospect enters your organization's orbit. It's the first real relationship building activity that you carry out with each of your prospects. Now, we talked about non ask events at length earlier in this module. Holding a non ask event is one of the most common entry points for new prospects. Many nonprofits hold informational gatherings at their location or at a local business or supporter's home to introduce their mission to a new group of prospects. Tours of your facility also work well for this purpose. For your major donor system, having a group of donors come to a non-ask event and invite their friends can be a powerful way to begin the relationship building process. So too can asking a board member, donor, or other supporter to host a small event in their home or office and invite their friends and colleagues to attend. Generally, I like to tell nonprofits that they should be holding a non-ask event as an entry point at least once per quarter. Over the course of that quarter, you can be talking with new prospects and inviting them to the event, which should last, as we said, somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes. Of course, events are not the only entry point for new prospects. Another great way to start the process is by setting up individual meetings with donors. If you have new major donor prospects, such as those referred by a board member, breaking bread with the prospect over a meal or simply meeting with them in their office for 30 minutes can be a great way to kick off a relationship. Phone calls can work as well. The key is that for major donor prospects to really enter your funnel, for you to really consider them part of your fundraising funnel, you need to have a conversation with them. This is true even if the prospective major donor is already a small dollar donor to your organization. All right. In order to truly have someone enter your major donor prospecting funnel, you'll need to have conversations with them in person and on the phone, as opposed to the mass communication that you're doing with low dollar donors. In thinking through how to approach new major donor prospects for the first time, I want to really answer two questions that may be on your mind. The first is, what do you do if your donor base is spread out? Many nonprofits have donors spread out all over the country or even the world or even, the state, and they don't have enough staff or money to be flying around to meet with donors one-on-one all the time for cultivation. That's okay. You can still run a strong major donor program even if you aren't able to meet in person with your donors several times over the year. Of course, if you can meet with your major donors in person once or twice a year, you should. If there are pockets of major donors in certain cities, such that you can plan one trip and meet with several during that trip, I want to encourage you to do so. Meeting face to face with current major donors and with major donor prospects is almost always worth it for your nonprofit if you have the time. Likewise, if you have the staff time to fly out and meet with your largest donors one on one, even if one of those donors is in a city with no other donors, it might be worth it in terms of ROI. Only you can decide that. One great way to leverage a trip like that would be to ask the donor if they would be willing to host a non-ask event for you. If you could take a trip out to meet with one of your largest donors, plus meet a number of his or her friends, it will greatly increase the return on investment that you're putting into the trip for time, money, and energy. But as I said, even if you can't meet with all of your donors in person, your major donors in person, you can still cultivate them effectively, even though they're major donors. The best way to do this is to simply pick up the phone. The phone is one of the most underrated tools in the fundraiser's toolkit. We talk a lot about in-person meetings and a lot about direct mail and fundraising letters and a lot about emails and websites and social media, but for some reason, the humble phone is often seen as a quaint relic of the fundraising past. I can tell you that it's not a relic. The best major gift officers in the world are constantly on the phone talking with donors. If you want to see a huge boost in fundraising revenue for your nonprofit, start calling your donors. Call them to thank them. Call them to tell them stories. Call to give them updates. Call to ask them for gifts. The phone can be a very powerful fundraising tool. So you can definitely use the phone for introductory meetings with major donor prospects that you can't meet with them in person. Another great way to meet with certain prospective donors is video conferencing, Zoom, video chat. Now, as you can probably imagine, not every donor is going to want to meet over video conference, but some will. For those that do, you can use an online video conferencing tool to have a virtual in-person meeting with your prospective major donor and start to build your relationship with them. The second key thing I want to address in terms of approaching a new major donor for the first time is, how do you get them meeting? Or for those donors you can't meet with in person, how do you set up a call? This is one of the most common questions I get from fundraisers, and let me tell you, I understand. Major donor prospects are generally busy people, and I know how hard it can be to get a meeting set up. So here are my top 3 tips for getting a major donor prospect to agree to a meeting or a call. Tip number 1, get an introduction. We talked about the power of referrals earlier, and so I'm not going to go over it much, but it bears repeating. If you can get a referral, you're going to be much more likely to be able to get a call set up. All right. So if you can get someone to introduce you to the donor who knows the donor and who knows your nonprofit, it's going to build trust and you're going to be able to set up that call. Tip number 2, be persistent. there's a saying in advertising that someone needs to see your message 7 times before they even realize what you're pitching. Something very similar applies in nonprofit fundraising. You need to get your message in front of potential donors many, many times before you break through the clutter. Remember, people are busy. They have jobs and families and hobbies and vacations and all of the little things that go on in life. Just because they don't respond to your first contact doesn't mean you should give up. As fundraisers, we often think that if we reach out to someone one time with a call or email and they don't get back to us, they aren't interested and would never make a gift to support our work. But nothing could be further from the truth. If you want to be able to successfully set up meetings or calls with major donor prospects, you need to be persistent and be willing to reach out to them multiple times before giving up. Now, obviously, you don't want to be rude, and there certainly needs to be a point after which you can safely say that the person doesn't seem interested in your work. I would actually tend to agree, though, with that marketing maxim I noted earlier. When it comes to major donor prospects, you need to be able to reach out to them a minimum of 7 times through various channels before you can say that they don't want to talk to you. Of course, if don't, during those 7 emails and calls, the person explicitly gets back to you and says they're not interested, you can take them off of your prospect list and stop communicating with them. All right. So think about how you can go about reaching out to your major donor prospects over and over again without seeming rude. And then the third tip is to move up the hierarchy of donor touches. I like to think all of the main ways you can contact a donor, or to think of all of them as what I call the hierarchy of donor touches, moving from the least personal to the most personal. I like to move up that hierarchy as I try to reach out to a new major donor prospect for the first time. Using this hierarchy assumes that the person wasn't introduced to you by a mutual contact, obviously. Otherwise, you would use that method. If a board member or donor introduces you to a prospect via email or sets up a lunch for the three of you, then you can skip right to that place in the hierarchy. But if you're reaching out to a new major donor prospect for the first time without the benefit of that type of introduction, here's what I found to be the most effective. First, start off with a snail mail letter. We're actually working down this list. I don't know if that was the right way to put this since I called it a hierarchy, but we're working from top to bottom. Start with a snail mail letter. Keep it short, just 1 page, and use it to introduce yourself and your organization and talk about why the person should be interested in learning more about your work. You can include your donor prospectus if you have one, but I would suggest that you not send an annual report as part of this letter. It feels too soon. It feels like jumping the gun. You can also consider sending what we call lumpy mail, which means sending your introductory letter with something unusual that makes the package you seem interesting and makes it stand out from the other mail in the pile. Make it something lumpy and appropriate for your work. For example, if you want someone to open your letter and you're a wildlife preserve, why not send a letter with a stuffed animal that looks like one of the animals at your facility? Or if you're a scholarship fund, send a packet of colored pencils along with your letter. It's going to feel weird in the person's hand if it's in an envelope. They're going to want to open it. It's going to feel like something interesting. Of course, lumpy mail isn't required. You can simply send an introductory letter and a donor prospectus, but lumpy mail does work. If you use it, though, use it carefully and watch your costs to make sure you don't break the bank. After the snail mail letter, I like to wait about 7 to 10 days to make sure they've received it, and then follow up on the next part of the hierarchy with an email. In this day and age, an email is actually seen sometimes as more personal than a snail mail letter because it goes right to the person's inbox. In the email, tell the person that you're writing to make sure they got the letter, to reiterate why you think the person will want to talk to you, and then to ask them to set up a call or meeting. Keep the email short. Nobody wants to read a long email from someone they don't know. So no more than 200 to 300 words, and I actually prefer really closer to 200 max. And a day or two after you send the email, follow up with a call. Use the call to try to set up the meeting or to ask the person if there would be a good time to set up a longer call. Of course, you should also be prepared to have a conversation with the person that you're calling right then and there if they have the time. The most likely scenario, of course, is that your call will go to voicemail. If so, mention mention the letter and the email that you sent, and then ask the person for a meeting or a call and tell them that you'll call back tomorrow if you don't hear from them. Then I would spend the next several weeks following up with emails and calls. Not every day, but trying to be in contact at least twice per week. The person will either get in touch with you to set something up, or they'll get in touch with you to tell you they're not interested, or they will ignore you. Once you get in touch 7, 8, or 9 times over the course of a couple of weeks, if they don't actually set up the call or meeting, you can safely remove them from your list or move them to communication only, which is what I call just your email list if they're already on your email newsletter. You've done your job. Now you can move on to your next prospect. Okay, before we wrap things up, we've talked about how to approach a major donor prospect for the first time and how to find major donor prospects. Let's talk about cultivation for a minute. I want to talk about all the different ways you can cultivate and communicate with your major donor prospects, meaning all the different ways to build a relationship with your major donor prospects after that first meeting, but before you ask them to give. Remember that your goal here is to build a major donor cultivation system. I've said this before. If you've ever heard any of my classes before, and I say it really all the time because it's so important, you can't do everything. There are hundreds or thousands of ways for you to cultivate major donor prospects, just like there's thousands of ways for you to find major donor prospects. Well, we talked about 3 of them. You can't do all 1,000 ways to communicate with your major donor prospects or cultivate them. You need to follow what I call the rule of 2 to 4. You need to pick 2 to 4 ways, 2, 3, or 4 ways to cultivate your prospects that make sense for your nonprofit. It's the same for finding new prospects. It's the same for making asks. What are the 2 to 4 ways that we're going to make asks this year? What are the 2 to 4 ways we're going to find new prospects this year? So let's talk about, so when we're talking about cultivation, you need to think through, even though I'm going to go over a number of different ways, what are the 2 to 4 ways we're going to talk to and cultivate our donors this year? All right, so I briefly want to go over what the most common strategies are that are used by nonprofits of all sizes for cultivating major donors, and really all kinds of donors. The first is donor communications. Your donor communications are the backbone of your cultivation efforts. Really, your email newsletter is the backbone of your donor communications, which in turn is the backbone of your cultivation efforts. Communicating with your prospects on a regular basis is a great way to strengthen your relationship with them. Possibilities include sending out a paper or email newsletter, mailing out annual reports, keeping your website updated, doing short e-blasts to your network, etc. All right. Um, know this, your major donor cultivation efforts will rely, even though there's lots of more personal ways to communicate with your major donors, the foundation that you'll rely on are your donor communications, even your humble email newsletter. Now, another great way to cultivate those major donors, obviously we talked about this, is through in-person meetings, phone calls, Zoom meetings, or a combination of all 3. All right, so if you lay a foundation with donor communications, and then you're doing some calls, some meetings, some Zoom meetings, some in-person meetings, that's going to be a great 1-2 punch for your major donor communications. We talked about non-ask events and cultivation events. These are another great way to cultivate your major donor prospects. You can also consider doing other types of events for major donors and major donor prospects, such as bringing in a guest speaker or holding a roundtable discussion. Try to invite your major donors to at least one, and perhaps more than one, free events hosted by your organization each year that are directly related to your mission. Now, you may not think of volunteer work as a cultivation strategy, but it can be, even for major donors. When people donate their time, it's often a first step towards donating their money. So offer volunteer opportunities so that your prospects, including major donor prospects, can get actively involved without opening up their wallets. It'll make them feel like part of your team, and it'll put you in a greater position to ask for a gift at a later date. Remember, even if you don't currently offer volunteer opportunities, with some creativity, every organization can find something for volunteers to do. The same thing really can be said for committees. Placing prospects on a committee that is doing something related to your nonprofit is a great way to get a major donor engaged before you ask them for money. For example, you may form a committee of people to look at different ways to generate more PR and buzz around your organization. Or you could pull together an auction committee that runs a silent auction at your next fundraiser. Getting people working for you as part of a group is a great way to keep them engaged. Closely related to the volunteer and committee membership ideas is the idea of asking your donors and prospects for advice. I love asking the people I'm cultivating for advice because once someone gives you advice, they start to feel invested in your work and they want to see you succeed. Remember, just because you ask someone for their advice does not mean you have to take it. You just need to listen and to thank them for their suggestions and tell them you'll be considering all the ideas they gave you. The best ways to ask major donors for advice are on the phone or in person, or sometimes via email, but always one on one. For smaller donors, you can also ask through mass communications like sending out surveys and polls via email to your entire donor contact list. And then the last kind of strategy for donor cultivation I want to mention is PR or public relations. Now, you may not think about public relations as a way of cultivating donors, but in a way it is. Each time a prospect sees a story about your nonprofit in the local paper, or hears about you on the radio, or you can send a clipping from the paper or a link to a story about your nonprofit, she or he will not only feel great about their association with you, but will also feel the desire to continue getting more involved with your efforts. Your best bet for prospecting and for cultivating are to mix and match all of these tactics, using a number of them over the course of the fundraising cycle. So for if you're cultivating donors, you may want to send out 4 e-newsletters per year plus 2 paper snail mail newsletters each year, as well as 1 annual report. Honestly, if you're using an email newsletter, you probably want to send it out at least once a month, if not more often. In addition, you could schedule quarterly non-ask events and once per year hold a drive to get people to sign a petition focused on your issue or to volunteer at a big volunteer day. If you keep the activity level up and keep giving prospects and donors opportunities to get involved, they will, and they will deepen their relationships with your nonprofit. Okay, I know that was an info-packed hour, a lot of information, and I hope you found it helpful as you build your major donor program. Now, I'd be happy to any questions you may have about what we talked about today.
Thank you so much, Joe. This has been so insightful and so methodic. Definitely gives us a lot of key takeaways and very practical things that we're able to implement at organizations. So, yeah, thank you everyone for sticking with us. And thank you, Joe, for such a great presentation. So I want to open it up to questions for just the next couple of minutes here. Yeah, please feel free to send your questions into the question pane or also in the chat. So yeah, so this is a question that Amy sent in really early on in the discussion. So I think you kind of have really hit on some of it. But Amy asked how to create a program with little assistance from the board.
Yeah, so I'll give a couple of different ways to look at that question. The most direct answer, of course, is to to uh, to set up lots of different opportunities to put yourself in a place to meet new donors. So when I say, for example, asking for referrals, most people hear, well, Joe's saying ask the board to help us meet new donors. But there's no reason to restrict that kind of referral system, and you really can build a system. You can be systematic behind your referrals. There's no reason to restrict that to your board. You can ask other donors to make referrals. You can ask volunteers to make referrals. You can ask people at other organizations to make referrals. You can ask, this is one that works for some organizations, local politicians to make referrals, right? If you're doing good work in a politician's district, I guarantee they know all the donors in that district. You're doing good work there. maybe they'd be willing to help you meet some of the key business people in that area, in your area. All right. Setting up those non-ask events and constantly being on the lookout for bringing in new donors through those non-ask events. It really can be, all these things can be done without the help of the board. They do take time. All right, so that's the kind of first answer. The second answer is that if you don't feel like you can get any board help with any of this, then you should be concerned with your board, because none of the things I mentioned in here were that you should go ask your board to ask for money, right? And I realize that many board members aren't comfortable asking for money. All right, that's a whole different question. But none of the things I mentioned were, okay, tell your board they have to go raise $5,000, or tell your board they have to go ask for money. These were all very gentle touch things. These would all fall under the umbrella of having your board be an ambassador for your fundraising program. So when I work with client organizations, you know, and we set up non-ask events, one of the key tests in my mind for board members' suitability for serving on the board is the board member willing to come to a non-ask event and bring a couple of friends, even though we've told the board member, there's not going to be any fundraising there. And I say that because I've worked with tons of organizations that had former clients on the board, meaning, homeless shelters that had people who they'd helped out of homelessness on the board. And those former clients were willing to come to the event and bring their friends who clearly didn't have money to come hear about how great the organization was, because that's what we're asking them to do. So if those former clients are willing to do that and board members aren't, then it's a deeper issue, a deeper culture issue on the board, and I'd suggest that's probably also something that you want to address. But that doesn't directly address your question. I would suggest the things that we're talking about in here really can be done without necessarily involving the board. And the way to multiply your time, if you're not getting help from the board, the way to multiply your time is to systemize it. The biggest example in there was the non-ask events. Okay, we're just going to set up right now a non-ask event each quarter. And as we're out fundraising, we're constantly going to be looking for people we can slot into those non-ask events. That's going to be a key thing we're looking for. I want to make sure that as I'm going out fundraising each quarter, I'm finding 5 to 10 people that I can ask to come to a non-ask event. Not to ask for money, come to a non-ask event. And that just becomes part of your system. And as I said, that really can be done without the board, and it snowballs on itself, because as you bring more people to non-ask events and they become donors, you can then ask them for referrals and to bring even more people to non-ask events. There's plenty of organizations that I've worked with that had their first ask event and they were real nervous, and they only had 5 people at the first non-ask event, and but they still plowed through with it, and a year later they were hosting non-ask events with 25 or 30 people. Imagine if you could get 30 prospects in the room 4 times a year. That's amazing for most nonprofits. So anyway, hope that answered your question.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, you never know who would be willing to like outside of the board, who would be willing in your networks to connect you with someone, like someone might even just be a volunteer, or just a consistent, smaller donor that knows someone that could be a good source for you. So I think it's just really about working through all of your networks and not just relying on your board's connections as well. Yeah, okay, cool. I think all of this is really good. Any more questions from anyone here? I think Sandy, you raised your hand, but if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the chat, or also put it in the Q&A pane. All right. Give it just a moment, see if there's any more questions that come in. But thank you so much, Joe. All of this has been really helpful, and just having even a schedule and that suggestion for having those non-ask events scheduled every quarter, I think is such an important thing to have already worked into your calendar, because then you can work towards that and work towards getting all of those prospects there. So I think having something that is ongoing and systematic is so important, and really standing up something that lasts for the long run and it isn't just a short-term strategy just bring in major donors here and there, but ultimately will help you build your major donor program for the long run. So, all right. Thank you so much, Joe, for everything. This has been so great.
You bet. Thank you, Candace, and thank you to everyone who was here. And just a reminder, our second module, we're going to be taking a look at how to actually make a major donor ask. So what does an ask conversation look like? And how do we thank our donors the right way? And how do we steward them so they become lifelong givers? So if anyone has any questions, or you're watching the recording and you have questions, feel free to email me anytime, joe@gerect.com, and I'd be happy to help.
Awesome. Thanks again, Joe, and thanks everyone who attended today, and for all of our future viewers as well. All right. Have a great rest of your day, and lots of things that we can take away from today's discussion. So thanks, everybody.